On May 19th, 2018, the world watched, nearly 30 million people to be exact, while Prince Harry, sixth in line for the British throne, married a California girl, activist Meghan Markle, making them the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. 30 million people. Think about that for a minute, because I know for a fact when I got married, I did not have 30 million people watching in angst and trying to enjoy that wedding ceremony. We did have some that watched on YouTube that couldn't make it, but it wasn't 30 million people. We didn't have 30 million people in attendance. And I don't think anyone else in here, to my knowledge at least, could say that. But 30 million people were concerned with two people that they'd never met. Many of them had never even had a conversation with him, had never shared a meal with him, and they were so concerned about their nuptials. Well, today I want to ask you to do the same. I want to ask you that are here today with us, and those that might be watching over the live stream, to be concerned with two people that we've never met, that we've never shared a meal with, that we will never have a conversation with on this side of heaven, and I want you to consider their marriage, their nuptials. And of course, we're talking about Adam and Eve. This is the first marriage that ever occurred in the history of the universe. That is important, and it deserves our consideration. It deserves our discussion. And so we want to look at a couple of points this morning, and then the lesson will be yours. First, I want to look at man and woman formed. These are the participants of the first marriage. The Bible tells me in Genesis 2, 4 through 7 that man is formed. And in fact, there's kind of a spoiler alert. You know what a spoiler alert is, right? It's where they spoil something before it actually happens. In Genesis 2 and verse 5, the Bible tells me that there was no man to till the ground. What is man? Man hasn't been created yet. Tells me then in verse 6, a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground, and the Lord formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of living life, and man became a living being. Man has always been part of God's plan. He always intended for man to be created, because even in Genesis 2:5, before man was, the earth was created to have a man to till the ground. That was part of man's purpose. Man was always part of God's plan. God knows what man needs, because then in verses 8 through 14, a garden is planted, the Garden of Eden. And where is this garden planted but for Adam to dwell in? It is a perfect home. It has all of the food that he needs. It has all of the types of necessities that would come for a living human being. And God did that for Adam. Again, God is always concerned with taking care of what's his. He immediately provides a place for Adam to live. He takes care of us. And the garden was a perfect place for Adam. But it did come with some rules. In Genesis 2, 15 through 17, I'm told by God that Adam is instructed that he can have any tree in the garden that he wants and freely from it, except the tree that is in the midst of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That tree, don't eat it. In the day that you eat of it, you'll surely die. Adam, let me make this simple for you. Look into the midst of the garden, you're going to see a tree. That's off limits. It's not for you. Some have suggested that God is harsh and he asks too much of us, right? But those arguments fail to see all that God has done for us. Think about for a moment what God has done for man. Man is formed. He gave man life. And then he gave man a place to live that life. Can Adam not, in turn, neglect one tree and avoid one tree with all that God has done for him? Absolutely. And God's not even done taking care of Adam yet. With all that God has done so far for Adam, this is a very small task. It's a very small ask. It's almost, as we could say, the least that Adam could do to repay the Lord. In the first 2 chapters of Genesis, you have a lot of this phrase being used. God saw that it was good, and it was good, or it was good, right? In Genesis 2, verses 18 through 20, we're told that it is not good that man should be alone. In Genesis 2:18, that's exactly what God says. I'm going to make a helper comparable to him. And out of the ground the Lord God had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to Adam. Adam, I want you to tell me what we're going to call these things. And as Adam begins to call each living creature, that was its name. And so he gave names to all cattle, birds of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam, there was not found a helper comparable to him. God is genius in that he made Adam realize that he was missing something without ever telling him that he was missing it. God didn't sit down with Adam and say, Adam, I think we need to talk about something. You don't have a mate. We need to fix this. Instead, God wanted Adam to see that he needed a mate. And so God has Adam name all of these creatures, and as he begins to name them, he realizes, well, there's 2 of them, and 2 of them, and everything that I'm naming has something that is comparable to it. And he begins to look and notice that he doesn't have that. And he sees the need. He realizes that he doesn't have someone suitable for him. And I would imagine, I can't say this for sure, the Bible doesn't tell me this, but I would imagine if that had been me, I would have felt lonely. Realizing they all have somebody, where's my person? And so God forms woman. He caused Adam to go into a deep sleep, the first anesthetic that we have recorded in the world. Adam goes into a deep sleep, and as he is sleeping, God takes one of his ribs and closes up the flesh in its place, and he takes that rib and he forms woman with it and brought her to man. Man and woman are connected. Adam and Eve were connected because God took of Adam to form Eve. And this bond that they have becomes stronger in the next few verses, because after man and woman are formed, we have the very first marriage. In Genesis 2:22, that last part of the verse, he brought her to the man. Anybody get a mental image in their mind of the wedding day ceremony? What's a tradition that we usually have done at the wedding ceremony? If the father is in good standing with the daughter, or if still alive and is able to do it, he will walk her down the aisle. I remember vividly during rehearsal, watching as we practiced our wedding. We did the, okay, Mark, you're going to now walk Megan down the aisle, and okay. But nothing prepared me for seeing her for the first time being brought to me to become my wife. Because that was a rehearsal the night before. That wasn't the real thing. And to watch as her father willingly walked her toward me and then willingly said, her mother and I are giving her to him. I felt special, loved and appreciated by them, and I hadn't even known them my whole life yet. I've known them a lot longer now than I did at that time, but for them to put that trust and that care into me was special. But now think about God putting Eve into Adam's care, the very first woman ever created, and Adam, being the very first man, is given that task and that responsibility to be her husband, to take care of her. And God felt that Adam was ready for that because he brought her to him. And Adam looks upon Eve and says, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She'll be called woman because she was taken out of man." What Adam saw was good, and he was pleased. But there is a rule for marriage. Really, there are a lot of rules that you might have that you might be able to say. If I were to say, give me some rules and guidelines for marriage, you could say, well, put your dirty clothes in the hamper. That's a rule for marriage. And you would be right. You might say, well, take the trash out when you notice that it's overflowing. That's one of our rules for marriage. And you'd be right. Happy wife, happy life. Okay. But those aren't the rules that are discussed in Genesis 2:24 and 25. God didn't say to Adam, okay, now that you're married, make sure the trash is never overflowing. Or make sure that the clothes are always put away and taken care of. That was not what was on the table for discussion. That wasn't the rule of marriage that was given. I want you to notice what was given. Therefore, since she is called woman and taken out of man, therefore shall a man leave father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. The rule of marriage is that you leave your mother and your father behind. You cleave to your wife, becoming one flesh. And the hope is that that is how you remain till the end of your days. That's the guideline of marriage. That's the rule of marriage. It's, I'm going to pledge myself to her. I will pledge myself to him. We will become one flesh, and we will only be each other's, which is illustrated in verse 25. There was nothing to be ashamed of for the man and his wife in being naked. The first marriage that we find provides a guideline for every marriage after it that sadly many have neglected. What about the application? I think most of our time, the rest of this time in our lesson, of course, will be spent here. First of all, I want you to notice that everyone has rules to follow. Everyone in this room is held accountable to someone or something in some way, in some form. Those of you who work in a secular job that are not your own boss, you have a supervisor. Those of you that might say, well, I'm retired, what about me? Do you drive? Yes? Then you are accountable and held accountable to the standard, the rules of the road. And you break those rules, there are consequences for doing such. What about me? I'm just a kid. I can't drive. I don't have a job. Well, Ephesians 6 and verse 1 tells me that children are to obey their parents in the Lord, for this is right. Proverbs 1 and verse 8 has the writer asking his son to hear the instruction of a father and not forsaking the law of his mother. Everyone is accountable and has rules that they have to follow. And ultimately, all of us, according to the book of John, have to follow the commandments of the Lord if we want to be his friends. John 14:15, John 15:14. You love me, keep my commandments. You are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you. I have a responsibility to follow the rules. Adam was given a rule in the Garden of Eden. Do not touch that tree. Don't eat it. You'll die. Everyone has rules to follow. But God knows what he's doing, is the second application that I'd like to make from this chapter. God knew when Adam was alone that it wasn't good, and therefore he said it would be better if Adam had a helper. And so he gave him Eve. But God also knew what he was doing when he created the rule in stating you cannot eat of this tree. What did we know of the tree? We know now that that tree opened the eyes of Adam and Eve, which we'll discuss next week. It opened their eyes, and they realized that their nakedness being so open in the world was a shameful thing. And they had to cover themselves up, but they also opened themselves up to a world of good and evil. Nothing is called evil in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. But that word will start to come up more often from Genesis 3 onward. God knows what He's doing. God knew what He was doing when He created the rules that we talked about. Such as children, you need to obey your parents, or as Hebrews 13:17 tells us, we are to follow the elders and follow their guides and their instructions so long as they're being biblical. They have the rule over us because they watch over our souls, and how we are to obey the Lord and follow the Lord, 1 John 2:3-4. God knows what He's doing. And when we do what God says in the way that God said to do it, we're never wrong. You follow the instruction manual, and you do everything the instructions say, and you do it the right way according to the instructions, you won't mess up. So when God was faced with a decision of the helper to give Adam, what did He choose? But woman. God understood that Adam needed somebody. He understood that, and God knew that he needed a helper. God could have, and I want you to understand this because it could have been this way. God could have then chosen, and He would have been right to do such, to place a man in the garden with Adam, had He so chosen. Had that been the way God determined would be the best way, and that was the way God wanted, then that would have been what God would have done. And He would have been right to do so if that's what He chose. Because we've already established that God knows what He's doing, right? But God didn't put a man in the garden with another man. Not because a man and a man cannot have a profitable relationship in this life. I have many friends that are men that I'm close to, as a friend can be close to. And in fact, the Bible talks about a friend sticking closer than a brother. And you have a love for your friends at times that is stronger and a bigger bond than you would have even with your own family. And so it is not that God said that a man and a man couldn't get along, but it was that they couldn't have a marriage together. That's what God was saying. God was not trying to act as though men and men would never get along in this life, but that man and man can't work as a husband and wife. God could have so chosen to have told Adam, I made a mistake. You're actually a woman. I know I created you as a man, but that was a mistake. Really, you are not supposed to be Adam. You are a female. So I'll create a man, and he'll become Adam, and you'll become Eve. But is that what God did? Did God make a mistake when He created Adam as a man and Eve as a woman? Can I submit to you this morning that if He did, then how can I trust Him to do anything else right? If God can't get gender right, okay, how can I trust Him to get salvation right? How can I trust Him to get the church right? How can I trust Him to get the family right? No, God did choose right. God did get it right. He knows what He's doing. And when He determined that man and woman would be created, that was how it was supposed to be for marriages from that point onward. Jesus would reiterate this thought in Mark 10, also in other gospel accounts that we have through Matthew through John. But Jesus would say in Mark 10, verses 2-9, that God created them first male and female. Therefore, and He recounts the first marriage. When Jesus wanted to tell the people what a godly marriage was, what did He present to them? Adam and Eve. does that not mean that they're the standard for what a marriage is supposed to be when it is done and completed? Now, can we say that they were a good standard after they had been married and had children? Not at times, but mothers and fathers aren't perfect. But when they were married, they were the standard. They are the standard. And God knew that, and Jesus himself knew that because he was present at creation, John 1 through 3. And he states, man and woman is how God intended for marriage to be. And that's it. And what God has joined together, Mark 10 and verse 9, let not man separate it. Therefore, with our laws today, where we have man saying that man and man is okay, woman and woman is okay, a man saying that he was actually born as a female, but it was just wrong. Somehow his body didn't match up with what his brain is. Or a woman saying the same, my body didn't match up with my brain. I'm actually a man. When our world is telling us that that is okay, but the Bible doesn't ever document a situation like that, we have our standard. If the Bible, 2 Timothy 3 and verse 16, is profitable for instruction in righteousness, then if it were possible that a man could be born a woman in a man's body, or a woman born a man in a woman's body, then God did us a disservice not documenting that and how to deal with it. If the Bible is all profitable for instruction in righteousness, how to live a righteous life, and God didn't tell me how to deal with that, then God did me a disservice. And again, if God did a disservice there, how can I trust him anywhere else? Either God messed up or he knows what he's doing. I'd rather choose this one. First of all, because it's right, and second of all, because this one presents a ton of problems and a ton of difficulties that the church would have a hard time navigating, because when we stand in the pulpit and say, "Be ye holy, for I am holy," someone could justifiably ask, how do we know God is holy? Because he messed up there. Or the Bible says that a man needs to be... How do we know that women can't be elders? Because he messed up there. You see the problems that come about and how it all unravels if God made a mistake in Genesis 2. No, God knew what he was doing when he created man and woman. Third, we have to be ready to get married. Now, you might be able to tell from the way that the screen looks, but I enlarged the word ready and underlined it more than the rest of the text for a reason. The idea of leaving father and mother behind, I've said this before, Brother Dan Winkler told us this last year when we were privileged to go to the marriage seminar up in Pigeon Forge, is the idea of setting something down and walking away from it. Leaving that part of you behind. And when I told my mother and father that I wanted to marry Megan, I told them that I was ready and prepared to move out of the house and start my life with her. And my mother and father looked at me and said, "We believe you." Now, Megan knows this. This is not news to her, but there were other girls that I liked and had even dated. And because the purpose of dating is to get married, the thought was always on my mind of, is this the right mate? Is this the right person for me? And those individuals are not horrible people, but they weren't right for me. I wasn't right for them. And if I had sat down with my mother and father with them, I really believe they would have looked at me and said, "We don't think you're ready yet." When I was an immature boy, My mother and father would have looked at me and said, "You're not ready yet." We're not saying when we leave father or mother behind that they're no more than a piece of trash that we put into the receptacle and then take out to the garbage can, take to the street and let it go to the dump. That's not what we're saying about our mother and father. I have in a box in our attic a ton of action figures, okay? And I kept them well before we knew about Adam in the hopes that one day I might have a son and I might be able to pass those down to him and let him have them. I don't play with them anymore right now. I'm sure if he ever asked me to, that I would be willing to get down and play with him and with those action figures, but I don't take my action figures out that I once played with as a kid and play with them now. Why? I set them down and I walked away from them. I grew up. I remember watching Toy Story 3 with my mom and dad, and all three of us were practically about to cry because of how it depicted this idea of growing up and putting the things behind that you loved and appreciated so much as a child. And while those characters are not real, they're not actual human beings and living characters, but we had resonated with them. We had loved them. We'd watched them on the screen, and when it was closing that chapter at that time, we were all sad because it was the realization of that is what childhood is like when you leave it behind. It's as if you never see them again. They're no longer a part of you anymore. With our parents, this is the task that we have. I am instructed to be ready to walk away from my mother and father and to start my own life, but it doesn't mean that I never see them again or never spend time with them again. I don't know your situation. Perhaps, unfortunately, that is what happened. Perhaps your parents didn't like who you picked, or his parents didn't like that he picked you, and so you don't have a great relationship with them. I know that happens. Perhaps it was because you became a Christian and they weren't, and so they didn't appreciate your mate because of their influence on you spiritually. I know that happens. You and I have to be willing, though, if that is the case, to set that down and walk away from it. And to not dwell upon it and to not stress about it and to not worry about it, because we have a life. We have a husband. We have a wife. We are one flesh. We don't have to be validated anymore by mama and daddy. I love to hear my dad tell me that he thinks I've done a good job. But I can honestly tell you I like to hear it from my wife a lot more. Growing up, it was everything to hear my mom and dad tell me I did a good job. But when she says it, it's different. And when I disappoint her, it's different. Because it's as if I've disappointed myself, as if I've hurt myself, as if I've let myself down, because we're to be one flesh. What's hers is mine. What's mine is hers. I have to be ready to be doing that, though. I'm not a little kid anymore. I'm still young. But I'm not what I was when I was Ian's age or Welby's age or any of our other young guys that we have here. I've grown up. And I know a lot of parents right now are stressing over matters like where they're going to go to college. What are they going to do with their lives? Are they going to get their driver's license in the next couple of years? Some of you parents might be thinking, you better stop talking. I don't want to think about my kids driving. But when they do get that driver's license, you might think, are they going to be safe on the road? When you hand them the keys for the first time and let them drive off, you're going to sit there and wonder, please get home safe. I don't want you to get home and have had a wreck. And you can have a wreck as long as you're okay. The car doesn't matter anymore, but we want you to be safe. Or do you worry about them coming home and saying, Mom, Dad, I got a ticket? Parents, we will stress over far less. But now more than ever, we have to stress about who our children are going to marry. I never thought growing up I would have to ask certain questions potentially of the one my son will bring home, and try to find out certain things that are so important now, because marriage is a lifelong commitment, and once you say I do, you did, and that's it. Therefore, you must know that who you picked is the right one, and that there is nothing keeping you back from the Lord and from His kingdom. But I never thought I'd have to think about asking certain questions. Questions such as, were you born a girl? Are you actually a girl, or did your parents believe you when you told them that you think you were a boy or a girl trapped in a boy's body? Did they take you and go through that procedure? And some families now are being tasked with doing that. And some families are doing that. Parents, we've got a responsibility, because our children are going to bring home someone someday. And they're going to tell us that they like this individual. And if we turn a blind eye to who they bring home, and not just whether or not they're actually biologically a male or female, but are they going to be a good spiritual influence on our children? If we turn a blind eye to that, it is very possible that their marriage will end up in disarray. I know of a family that got married too young. They weren't ready. And they're not together anymore. And that family has been broken up. They didn't have children or anything of that nature, so at least that can be said, but they're not together anymore. And that's not what God wanted. We have to be ready to get married. Parents, we have to make sure our children are ready to get married. But we have to be careful how we do that. It is not wise to put out ultimatums before our children to tell them, well, you won't get our blessing if they're not a Christian. That's not wise. The reason for that is there have been cases of people who just get wet because that's the only thing they have to do to become a Christian. It is not wise to say, well, I'm not going to allow this to be done for such and such a reason if it's not a biblical reason. You can tell them, I don't agree with it if they're not a Christian, but be careful how we approach that. Because is it better for that person to get into the water and become a Christian in name only and not live their life as a Christian, and to think that they're saved for all of the rest of their lives, not understanding and counting the cost just so that they can get married? Parents, we have a great task in preparing our children for marriage. Not every marriage will work out. Some of them won't work out because of scriptural reasons. Adultery may come in. Death may occur, and you may find someone and remarry them, and the Lord understands, and the Lord won't hold that against you. He provided scriptural reasons for marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Therefore, He won't hold it against you if one of those things occurs. That brings me to the last lesson, though, and that is there are benefits to being married, but those benefits of marriage are only for you and your spouse. You know, the difference between Genesis 2:25 and Genesis 3:7 is stark. There's a stark difference. In Genesis 2:25, I'm told that man and woman were not ashamed. The man and his wife were not ashamed to be naked in front of one another, but in Genesis 3:7 they were. Because they realized it was no longer just man and woman, man and wife that would be seeing that. And they tried to cover themselves up, and they did a poor job of doing it because God reclothed them at the end of Genesis 3. But when God created man and woman, it was intended for them to be eyes only for the other. And sadly today, many people don't have this realization. My wife tells me that I am hers, and I tell her that she is mine. And that's not in a you're mine and you can't be with anybody else type mentality, but it's a, I vowed my life to you and you vowed your life to me. Therefore, our marital life must be for only each other and no one else. Therefore, anything that might cause someone to stumble, anything that might cause someone to have a difficulty in seeing my wife as my wife and not as an object of lust is a bad idea. We must not be the vehicle of someone else's destruction. And men, we must not be so foolish to act as though we don't bear any responsibility in this too. It is my job to keep my head on a swivel. It is my job to look upon my wife and only my wife in such a way. Same for any man in this auditorium and in this world. And ladies, it is also your job to help us and help other men be able to look upon you as a pure human being, as brothers and sisters in Christ. Only the man and his wife can have that type of benefit. It wasn't given to anyone else. And when that type of benefit is taken, when we lust after an individual, we're already committing adultery in our hearts to the idea that if it were ever on the table, it's going to be a lot easier to say yes than it will be to say no. God understood that. And that's why in Genesis 2:25 we see there's no shame between a man and his wife. And we need to keep it that way. But Genesis 3:7 is in the Bible. It does exist. And it tells me that we can cause the other to stumble by the way that we dress or lack thereof. Adam and Eve were created and they became husband and wife and became one flesh. The first ever family that we read about in the Bible. But they stumbled. And we'll talk about that next week. And we talked at the beginning of this lesson about a royal wedding on May the 19th. Well, on day 6 of creation, the world witnessed the first ever marriage and was shown its first ever married couple. And the example has lived on even till now and should live on well beyond today and this year and years to come. But we have to make sure we hold that standard up. I watched a movie a couple of years ago called The Founder, and it was about the individual who started what we now know as the McDonald's fast food chain. And in that movie, at the very beginning, it shows you that McDonald's had this great standard that they were upholding. Good, nice food, but very fast. And the two individuals that this man ended up stealing the company from, essentially, had created such a system where the burgers would be made, but they would be fresh, and the fries would be made, and they would taste great, and the food would not be bad. But somewhere along the line, a standard was forgotten, to where it's kind of hit and miss if you go to a fast food restaurant called McDonald's. You might get good food, you might get cold food, you just don't know. But we also know of a stereotype for Chick-fil-A. If you've ever eaten there, you know the stereotype of Chick-fil-A is they know what they're doing, and we always say, you guys need to go tell everybody else how to get it going. Food is fast, it's fresh, it never have bad service, and if you do, you're more than willing to forget it because it never ever happens. You know why? Someone in that organization is taking great care to make sure that standard is upheld. Our marriages in this world are falling apart, and do you want to know why? Because we have not taken the standard and continued it. Oh, we might have, But we've allowed this world to say that the standard for marriage has changed. It's different. Maybe you're here this morning and you're not a child of God, and you've bought what the world has been selling. You can become one by hearing, believing, repenting, confessing, being baptized. All of those things have to be done. They're necessary. But perhaps you've done those and have fallen away. You can come back to the Lord. We need each and every one of you fighting on the front lines to help this country get more godly. Won't you take part and come as together we stand and sing?